You are listening to Women's Running Stories, where exceptional women runners share inspirational stories about their running experiences.
Hi, I'm Starre Vartan. I'm a science journalist, and I split my time between the Pacific Northwest, Puget Sound area, and the Sydney coast in Australia.
Yes, in this episode, you're going to hear the athletic and running journey of Starre Vartan and how that experience and her professional life as a science writer merged and resulted in her groundbreaking new book, The Stronger Sex: What Science Tells Us About the Power of the Female Body. But before you hear more from Starre, I want to welcome you to Women's Running Stories. I am Cherie Louise Turner. I am the host and producer of this podcast. Thank you so much for being here. Now on to Starre's story, which is a little different from the stories you typically hear here. Starre's story isn't only about running. She is a runner. She's also a swimmer and a dancer and a weightlifter. And Starre doesn't compete in running. She doesn't have dreams of running marathons or setting PRs. But being a runner, being an athlete, has been fundamental to her understanding of just how capable and strong and resilient and tough women's bodies naturally, innately are. As she has talked about, her own experiences and role models left her questioning the messages she was getting about women being the weaker sex and of aging women being frail. So she pointed her science research in the direction of answering her own questions about the strength and capacities of the female body, and she wrote The Stronger Sex. This is a book that has profoundly evolved my own thinking about women's bodies and our abilities and our capacities as athletes, and it shines an even brighter light on how underestimated, disrespected, and held back we have been in modern times, much more so than I'd ever fully appreciated. Starre's book has also left me feeling even more confident and thankful in the body that I have, and also even more optimistic about its abilities as I age. Starre's own story embodies much of what her book is all about: living the strong, athletic life women's bodies have always been built for. And in writing her book, she too has developed an excitement about being strong and powerful as she ages. So let's get into it. Let's hear Starre Vartan's story, which she told from Australia. Now here to tell her story, beginning from the time she was a child, is Starre Vartan.
When I was very young, I lived with both of my parents in Australia, and we traveled throughout, the Pacific Islands. They were big travelers and hippies, as you might be able to tell from my name. And it was this like wonderful, idyllic, my earliest memories. And so that is when I actually learned to dance. I have pictures of myself when I'm 3 years old learning to dance. And then also I was swimming from the time I was literally a baby. I was one of those babies that was in the water. Being half Australian, that's very normal here. My father was a swimmer. And so my earliest memories are of being in the water and of dancing to music. And then as I got older, I came to the United States with my mother and was actually raised by my grandmother in the Hudson Valley of New York. And my voyage to getting there was pretty bumpy. My mother was a fairly young parent and was not able to take care of me. And so I ended up with my grandma, who was a very physically active person and very energetic, even in her 60s and 70s, which is when I was growing up with her. And she was very sort of Protestant work ethic-y. She always saw that physical activity should be tied to doing something useful. So she was a big, um, very judgmental about people who went to gyms. My dad and my uncle were those people, and she just thought this was ridiculous. That everything that you could do physically could be any type of exercise you want to do could be done through some type of useful work. She was a big gardener. We had a lot of acreage of flower and food gardens, and there was always projects to do around our property. And in her defense, she was in great shape in her 60s and 70s during a time when, people of her generation weren't as focused on exercise. She was born in 1918. So yeah, that was, going to the gym and all that stuff wasn't, a normalized thing among her generation. Her one exception to that, and so I have this on both sides of my family, was she was a dancer as well. And so that was her sort of hobby. And she had done it competitively as a young person, had actually met my grandfather that way, dancing in New York City. She won the Harvest Moon Ball one time, which used to be at Roseland, which was a venue in Manhattan. And I later went to rock shows at. It was demolished a few years back, which is really sad. So that is the one way I did see her let loose physically. And so that was my example. It was just my grandmother and me growing up together in the woods in the Hudson Valley. We were on a dead end road and had this wonderful property and lots of animals. And so the last thing I would say is that I learned a lot about movement from the dogs and cats that I grew up with, because we had 4 or 5 dogs and then we had cats as well. So 4 or 5 cats, 4 or 5 dogs at any one time. And so I ran around on my hands and knees with the dogs and cats a lot. I was out in the woods with the dogs and also observing other animals a lot. I've always loved, wildlife. So I feel like although I was going to school and playing with other kids, I also had wonderful lessons in movement from animals, and started running actually because I wanted to be like a deer on the deer trails in the woods around my house. And I literally would put myself in there to try to, figure out their point of view. And, when you're a kid, you're almost about the height of where a deer's head would be, which was really exciting to me. And so that was a huge lesson too. So I had, it's funny to think about your influences, because mine came not just from the humans around me, but also from the animals. So there aren't any runners in my family. People are very active on both sides, lots of activity, no running at all. And so I certainly was doing some of that at school, in the different sports games we were taught about in gym class, but I didn't have a format for that. Nobody was putting on their sneakers and going out running. My dad was a surfer, and I described my grandmother. My uncle was a swimmer and an arborist, so his job was actually quite physical. He was climbing trees all day. So I got into running really from that perspective of walking the trails and finding them and learning how to see the trails, which, it takes a little bit of time. I was very young when I was allowed to go out in the woods by myself. My grandmother would put a whistle around my neck and just say, if you fall and hurt yourself, blow the whistle and, I'll come find you. So this was a very independent childhood. This was the opposite of helicopter parenting. And so I was, 5 or 6 years old, and I was out on the trails by myself and sort of testing how far I would go from the house and figuring out how to follow trails. And as soon as I felt really comfortable with that, I think I was, 6, 7, being out there by myself. And then I wanted to go faster. You're a kid, you have all this energy. And I loved seeing the deer, and I would be startled by the deer. And, there's a feeling of wanting to chase the deer when they run, and also being afraid and wanting to run and feel like you're being chased yourself. And sort of both of those things, feeling that in your body as a kid. I remember that really clearly, and that just pushed me to run. And so I would be shooting down these trails, and I remember it was definitely more of sprints when I first started, because again, you're a child. I didn't have anybody telling me what to do, so I would just sprint as fast as I could down the trails and jump over things. I remember jumping over logs or whatever was in the path was really fun. I just remember seeking out those trails that had a lot of stuff on them, and also tree roots and rocks, and jumping over them and just figuring that out. It felt like it occupied my whole little brain. So, some of my friends were especially into soccer, but, I wasn't a team sports person. I did try out for the basketball team in eighth grade and I was not good at it. My uncle actually had played college basketball. And so I thought this was something I might be able to do, but I just am not so handy with a ball, turns out. And so I definitely never thought of myself as an athlete at that time. I look back and I know, oh, yeah, of course I was. You know, During that whole time, I not only was sort of had progressed in trail running, which is something I did very privately. It felt like my own little secret. It was not, this was, I would say the early to mid 90s. It wasn't something that people talked about as much or was known as much, especially on the East Coast. I feel like maybe West Coast kids may have heard of it more. But so I did that completely on my own. I was also a big horseback rider, competitive horseback rider, and I did think of that as athletic again. At one point, I decided I didn't really enjoy the competition, so I was just riding all of my neighbors' horses and exercising them constantly. I was also going on lots of hikes with my close friends and just talking all day long. And I lived in a town on the Hudson River that was quite mountainous, and so I would ride my bike down to my friend's house about 4 or 5 miles down the hill, and then I'd have to come back up. And so there was a lot of mountain biking on roads, but then also cutting through the woods as well. And so I was on the go. I was moving constantly and doing all of these activities and quite a strong early teenager and young teenager. But I never would have qualified myself as athletic because I wasn't on the soccer team. So my close friend Liz Wagner was on the soccer team and she also did cross country. And I remember her talking about that and just thinking it was so cool, but I never thought again that I was like a good enough runner or that I was strong enough or I was like the athletic girl. So I would ask my friend Liz questions about her cross country training and then I would like take some of those ideas to my own. I would probably say I was going like 2 or 3 times a week. I think even at that age, I didn't make the conscious connection, but high school is really stressful. I went from a smaller elementary and middle school in my little town to a larger school that was about a half an hour away, that was a bunch of different towns combined. And so all these new people, all these new inputs, it was kind of intimidating and scary in a lot of ways. And I was, I think being a teenager is just inherently stressful. It certainly was for me. So I immediately found that like going running after I got back from school was so helpful. And I think, when I felt especially awful, I would go out and nobody told me that. I kind of, I guess, figured it out on my own. And the other part of that was I had a Discman and I would listen to music because I'd been, I was such a dancer that I brought that into my running. And so sometimes I would run by just with nothing, but sometimes I would run with music when I felt really, really yucky, and really just horrible high school. Ugh, just the awfulness of that time. The music and the running together I would feel so much better afterwards. And I definitely think that, running for me was very, I don't know, it was very private. It was very solo. It felt like a secret almost at the time. I didn't ever talk about it with my friend Liz a little bit, but nobody else knew that I ran. So, and I'm kind of like I'm not sure exactly why that was, but that's how it was for me at that time. So my 20s was probably the least athletic time of my life. I was working in Manhattan and was writing a lot of stories about environmental health and toxins and for alternative weeklies that we used to have a lot more of in Connecticut and New York, and then doing editorial jobs where I was sitting all day. Thankfully, my very first job, we had a gym in the building. It was at the Jewish Community Center in Manhattan on the Upper West Side. So I was able to swim at lunch, which was really helpful. But that whole time period was me writing and working a lot and and not doing too much exercise. My partner at the time, we would go hiking on the weekends. But I look back and feel like my 20s was a little bit of a lost time in terms of my physical connection with myself. Towards the end of my 20s, I founded a website called EcoChick, which was a huge deal for a little bit. It was early internet days, and I was writing a lot about ethical fashion, sustainable design, and also health and women's bodies. And through that, I started learning more about the connections between health and environment and bodies. And through that, I really made a lot of the connections that formed the later part of my work. So I'd had that experience, and I'd also had this experience from my childhood of seeing my strong grandmother who raised me, who, I always say died with her muscles on. She always had she was an 80-year-old woman who was, building a stone wall at the last home that she moved into and moving those rocks. And that was my example of aging. And I also had this experience as a child when I was working alongside her or completing my chores of challenging myself and understanding my own strength and understanding how strong I was. So I brought all of that together to my writing eventually when I was able to start writing about I wrote about trail running, actually a little bit about barefoot trail running, which I started doing in my early 30s, and also writing about female strength and women's bodies specifically. And that's where I started really making those connections between my own experience, what I'd been told by the culture, which oftentimes contradicted my own experience, and then my understanding of my grandmother's body, and really wanting to challenge some of those ideas. And I will say with the barefoot thing, I was definitely influenced. I was a barefoot kid for sure. My grandma was we gardened barefoot. I was walking around our property, hanging out with the dogs, all that stuff. So I was used to being barefoot, but like the idea of barefoot running had never occurred to me. So that I was influenced there. So I was comfortable with bare feet. And, here in Australia, my father's the same way, very big barefoot person. Of course, Australian culture is very barefoot, but not the running. And so I remember when I was working in New York City, I was publishing my blog. I was, doing all of the work. I, basically had a job and a side hustle. And I remember seeing those articles pop up about the barefoot running. And there was the one guy who wrote the book about it, whose name I can't remember right now, who I reviewed the book. And I was like, this is great. I love being barefoot and I love running. So I just, started trying it. At that point, my feet were really not conditioned for barefoot because I was working in the city. But I remembered that I had that capacity at one time. And so I figured I could figure it out. And I did the barefoot, some of the sneakers. I had the Vivos, especially in the beginning when I was being influenced. I got those sneakers. In fact, I think that was I got a pair for free. This was like many, many years ago when it was still like, oh my gosh, they're going to send me a pair of sneakers for nothing. And I get to write about them. And I did. And those were great. And that was actually a really good transition. And it was really good for, obviously rockier trails. But most of the places that I was running were pretty conducive to running fully barefoot. And I loved it because I realized that you can get so much more information about the world when you're running barefoot. That was something that I knew about from doing chores and whatever, hanging out without shoes on. But to be able to run through the woods and have that experience of feeling the moisture in different places where you might guess it's there, but you didn't know, understanding you almost know where the trees change from like deciduous trees to evergreen trees before you even get there, because the soil and the way the earth feels under your feet changes is so exciting. And of course then you realize like, oh, yeah, my fingers and my hands are sensitive. So are my feet in many of the same ways. Of course, I have like pretty good calluses now, but you can gain so much more information about your environment. And I love that feeling of being immersed when I'm running and being so in that flow. I love anything where I can be in the flow, and trail running is certainly one of those things. And being you can get even more in the flow when you're paying attention to all those minute changes in your environment. And I find it like tickles my brain, for a lack of a better way to put it. I just my whole There's like a whole extra part of my brain that is working, and I that is so it feels good. That feels good to me. I mean, frankly, that's what it is. I mean, my big thing with running is I still run by myself and I really enjoy it. And my big thing now that I'm in I think it was my early 40s, I was like, I'm not doing any exercise unless I love it. And so I'm dancing, I'm running, I'm, swimming a lot here, especially, but also in the Puget Sound in the summers there. And I love all of those things. And so for me, when I'm out running, I'm the opposite of a lot of people. I think I'm not trying to get certain amounts of miles in. I'm not trying to get certain amount of time in. I'm out there to have fun and enjoy myself. And so I usually end up doing sprints, and then I do some jogs, and then, sometimes I'll, walk up a hill if there's something I want to look at. If there's a beautiful view, I'm not going to try to zoom past that. I am really in it for the love and exploring the place where I am and enjoying the feeling. And I'm not trying to pursue any particular goal, honestly, with any of my physical activities at this point. I'm there to just feel really good while I do it, because for me, as soon as it becomes something that I feel like I have to do, or there's a goal oriented thing around it, I'll back off. And if it's not fun, I won't do it. And so I have such big goals, and I'm so goal oriented in my work that for me, my exercise and my physical activity has to be the fun part of life. And that really works for me. So I started weightlifting at a gym with some really friendly and wonderful people, and I'm very grateful. I think the weightlifting community in general is just incredibly welcoming, open, and I didn't, you see these big burly guys, and you think they're gonna be judgmental, and I've never received more encouragement from anyone than these guys that I would have before this been a little intimidated to talk to. So I got into it because my aunt here in Australia has osteoporosis, and she was super freaked out by that because her mother had it as well, and her grandmother, so my great grandmother, was known as Little Nana, not because she started off small, but because she got so small because of osteoporosis. And then my grandmother, my aunt's mom, also had terrible complications due to osteoporosis and ended up breaking a hip and ending up in a hospital bed. And probably she lived to be 91 years old. How much longer could she live, slash what better health span, quality of life would she have had if she had had stronger bones? Maybe she would have lived to be 100. Who knows? I mean, the osteoporosis really was one of the reasons that she passed when she did. So, this is a concern for my aunt. It's a concern for me. And my aunt actually did the research. She's a real research hound, and found this incredible Australian program that was actually started here by Belinda Beck, who did all of the pioneering research into understanding how you can actually build bone back once you're osteopenic or osteoporotic. You can build bone back at any age, which is really hopeful. And so my aunt started weightlifting at age 69 in the program designed by Belinda Beck, which is, very, you start off very, very carefully. You have to build that muscle first, but it's really important. The science behind it is that you have these spaces in your bones that develop as your bones weaken from osteoporosis. And when you lift weights, those spaces become activated. The osteoblasts come in and fill those spaces in when the body understands that there's stress and strain happening there. But you need to actually lift pretty heavy weights for the bones to be able to behave in such a way that they send the messages to fill those spaces up and become stronger. So my aunt has done this. She has gained bone density, as the science has shown, people can. And crucially, it's much easier to gain bone density before you go through menopause, which I have not yet. And so I started lifting as soon as I heard that, because, estrogen does really help with, as we know from hearing a lot about HRT, really does help with keeping bones strong. And, typically women in menopause lose about 10% of their bone going through that process, that bone density. So it's been about 2 years. I've continued lifting weights. I have not become giantly bulky or super muscular, because that's a real genetic thing. Some people can a little bit, but for the most part, you just become stronger. My whole core is stronger. My legs are stronger, even though they were strong before. My posture is a lot better, and my back strength is really wonderful. And if you do get bulky, I think that looks pretty cool too. It's funny because a lot of people assume that's going to happen either for good or bad. Like, some people are like, I want to get bulky, like that would be cool, and other people are like, I don't want to get bulky, and it's like, it's kind of not up to you either way. Like, honestly, because I've seen people who are very visibly muscular, who've lifted weights a lot less than I have, and other people who are incredibly strong and lift very heavy weights, and you wouldn't really be able to tell by looking at them. I'm talking about, mostly women here. So it depends on your genes, it depends on your body type, it depends on what kind of other exercises you do. But it really is, you can't depend on it either way. I can say that, weightlifting will make you strong, and lifting weights above your head will make you feel amazing and very powerful, and it's really fun. But whether, it will change the way your body looks a lot or a little is really not up to you. And so with the weight training, I do feel like I have a lot more strength running. I can just feel it because I have more core strength throughout. And it makes it a lot easier to jump over things, especially, because I love being on the trail. I do, run a little bit on roadsides and things like that as well to get to trails. And I just kind of feel like it's easier to zoom through those. I also feel like the weight training has been great for my dancing. I do ecstatic dance, which requires a lot of jumping, or at least the way I do it is a lot of jumping, a lot of movement. And then I feel like the dance has also made me a better runner as well, because I'm just moving in I'm moving in more dimensional ways, so in other fields, rather than moving just forward and backwards, as I do with running. And I think that having both the weight training and the dancing, where I'm moving in other planes. There we go. That's the word I was looking for. In other planes has been really helpful, because when I'm trail running, it allows my side to side movement and my sort of uphill and downhill to be a lot more comfortable and fast, because I'm more comfortable like moving in sideways directions. And when I'm jumping over things, my landings are better. So I feel like all three of those actually feed into each other really nicely, because I have more strength and more ability in moving sideways and up and down than I did before. I really noticed that with my trail running, that I feel like I'm more 360 in my movement now. I'm not just like going forward, which feels really good. It makes it even more fun, in my opinion.
Starre continues to find fun and joy in movement, and it was in large part all of her lived experience as a strong, athletic woman who grew up with a strong, hardworking older woman that led her to writing The Stronger Sex.
So there's definitely a part of this that was embodied in terms of where the idea came from to write a book about all the strengths of the female body, of which there are obviously quite a lot. I mean, I will say I couldn't even fit all of the information in here that I wanted to. I delivered my draft to my editor at 142,000 words, and the book, as it is now, is 102. So I cut out a lot. And that's because there's way more to say, actually. But so the embodied part of it was that I'd learned all of the things we all learn, but I'd had the different experience in my own body. And also, I think having not necessarily done sports and been ensconced in that world, but having done a lot of other types of physical work and physical activity gave me a little bit of an outsider's perspective. And so, I came into this sometimes thinking, oh, like I'm not a sports reporter. I'm not a sports journalist. Like, should I be writing a book like this? And I think that actually gave me an advantage because in many ways I haven't been ensconced in that world where all of these assumptions come from about what women's physical strengths are. The other thing that I think, so that was the embodied sort of thing pushing me forward, that I just felt like my own physical experience was different from what the culture had told me for my whole life. The second part was I just wrote an article, a short piece, and it was received on this subject of just like how women's bodies are stronger in certain ways than male bodies. And I got such a positive response. There were all of these people saying, yes, this is like something that I've always felt was true, like I did, but have never seen spelled out. And even lots of men who were coaches of girls sports who had daughters or wives who or partners who were athletes, etc., were like, yes, we've seen this too. I mean, I was expecting all this terrible pushback and people to call me names on the internet. I've been on the internet a long time, and the response was the opposite of that. So that really led to me understanding that there was a book here. And then as I did the science research, we all know now that women's bodies have been very under researched. Only 6% of all sports science has been done on female bodies. So we have a tremendous amount to learn and a tremendous amount to test out. And that's happening right now, literally, and has been happening very recently. And so there's a lot of really interesting new science to talk about and give examples of. And that's kind of like what's in the book. And I do feel like in 10 years, I hopefully maybe we'll get to write an update or something, because there's going to be so much more to say on all of these subjects. So, I cover immunity and longevity and some of these fundamental strengths of the female body, but I also talk a lot about muscular strength and endurance and balance and flexibility and all of these other aspects of what strength I think should be, which is what all bodies are capable of, strength in these different categories. I mean, this goes for male bodies too. Not every male body is good at the things that, male bodies are generally better at than female. And so I think having a wider understanding of strength and including the different kinds of strength, not just the kind that, certain male bodies have, is completely logical and makes all the sense in the world to me. You wouldn't, say, oh, I'm gonna, look at the strength abilities of dogs, but I'm only gonna look at, the large dogs. Well, that's great, but like the large dogs have certain strengths and capacities, but then small dogs have other strengths and capacities. And so if we're only judging strength by what one small group of a larger group has, we're going to miss out on all this other great information that is important to both science and to, people who are doing sports, and even like thinking about what sports we could have and what kinds of physical competitions we could have if we acknowledge all these different kinds of varied strengths of the human body. So that's the other thing that I think is really fun and exciting about all of this, is that like by understanding strength in this limited way and having it defined by what male bodies tend to do generally a little bit better than female bodies, we have like limited the kinds of sports and competitions and physical stuff we can do in the world. And that's kind of a bummer. And the last part is, I think, that the culture really comes into a lot of this discussion. And all of those messages that I heard growing up, are real and impactful. And they affect how, female bodies do in sports and the training they get and the money they get. And all of that has just started changing. So I'm really curious to see, we do see this sort of 10% difference in these sports that were designed by men for men's bodies. Again, only looking at this very narrow way of doing any sport. We see this 10% difference in some of these between male and female bodies. That 10%, that's a pretty narrow place. And I think we're going to see that reduce over time as young girls, as children get better training, as girls going through puberty, which is that incredibly important time for developing muscles and developing strength and developing ability that boys are getting and girls aren't necessarily because of the way professional training is done. Just all of the cultural messages are changing. I think we're going to see a real significant difference in the future, both in how competitive female bodies can be in sports, but also I think we're going to see a flowering of new types of sports and competitive physical activity as well. Because as soon as you acknowledge that there's more than one type of strength, you can compete on those different types of strength and abilities. And that's really, really fun. So the thing that surprised me, I think, was learning about some of the muscle research. Sandra Hunter, who's now at the University of Michigan, really has pioneered this, and now other scientists have come behind her, showing how female muscles tend to be and why they tend to be great in endurance, which is something we're seeing out in the athletic world now, and how that has to do with fat metabolism and how important fat is for female bodies, and how again we're solving similar problems differently. So that was stuff that I had no idea about until I started reporting on it. And just the way that male and female bodies tend to be different, I'm talking about, on a population level, not individuals, is it solving problems differently. So that, through evolution, our bodies have different challenges and they solve them in different ways. Again, not one is better or worse. They both have strengths and weaknesses. And so I learned a lot about the details about that. The other thing that I thought was really exciting and interesting, that I didn't understand fully, was I always knew, oh, women tend to have like better immune systems than men, but I didn't know why that was. And the specifics of that are super fascinating. I mean, not only do we have better and innate immunity for, just we have more immune cells just patrolling around our bodies at any given moment, but our memory B cells have this incredible capacity to remember how to fight off viruses. They have better memories than those cells in male bodies, and that testosterone actually decreases your immune system. It actually suppresses it somewhat, and this is throughout the mammal and the animal kingdom, throughout all mammals. This isn't just human beings. You see all of these immune advantages and disadvantages. So that was just like, oh, I kind of knew this fact superficially, but like getting to know the details, it's amazing to think about how that has evolved over millions of years to bring us to the place where we are. How that's affected me in my own life is that it has given me more confidence, I think, in my own body, and I feel like a great sense of trust in its abilities, especially writing and learning about the people who do these incredible ultra endurance races, and people living through starvation and really intense conditions, pandemics and epidemics, and just in all of those cases, how female bodies just outsurvive male. I think fundamentally, it gives me confidence now as a middle-aged woman, and also about aging. I had this wonderful example in my grandmother, of course, but we get so many messages, and I think this is also changing, which is wonderful, about getting older and older bodies, all of us, but women especially, and that was this expectation that you're just going to become frail, and the science doesn't back that up. My own experience with my grandmother didn't back that up, and now we're seeing a lot of older women who are doing amazing things, especially even with weightlifting. They're setting new records like every week because, older ladies were always told to take it easy and not stress themselves because, especially if they have weaker bones, they should be really careful. And now we understand that the opposite is true, that if you are, you have osteoporosis in your family, as I do, that you should be lifting weights, that you should be doing those harder exercises to, very slowly and very carefully and a very smart way, not just lifting heavy stuff right off the bat, but doing that can actually build bone back. And so the argument for being strong as we age becomes greater and greater with every new piece of science that I'm seeing come across my desk. I mean, it's just amazing. Our bodies were built for longevity, and older women's bodies are built for being strong and capable.
I have been sitting with this for many days now. I have listened to it numerous times. Our bodies were built for longevity, and older women's bodies are built for being strong and capable. Yeah, wow. That is a message we need to get across to people. And there are many more messages like that in Starre's book, which I highly recommend. And that does bring us to the end of Starre Vartan's story on the podcast. Thank you, Starre, for coming on the podcast and sharing this really beautiful story. And thank you for writing your book. Now, I know you, like me, will want to follow Starre Vartan, so please look to the show notes and I will provide a link to her Instagram. There, you will also find a link to how you can purchase her book, The Stronger Sex, which of course I loved. I'm actually partway through reading it for a second time. And there is more to come. In the book, The Stronger Sex, Starre touches on how anthropologists have shown that women were actually not just gatherers, but also hunters, and they were warriors, and there are indications that women were exceptionally strong. And when Starre and I spoke, I told her that I really wanted to know more about that, what our ancestors were doing, and how strong and capable they actually were. Turns out, Starre is already on it.
Yeah. Well, good news. I can finally share. I'm writing another book, and it is going to be on that subject. So that's it. So it's literally because I had to actually cut out so much of the anthropology from this book, to cut that 40K words. So I took out a lot of the anthropology. I left some in, as you know, like here and there. I like dropped it in where I could, but like I took so much out. So that's going to be the next book. It's going to be because, like, the big thing with this idea and getting this idea out in the world is people come at me with the like, oh, but we evolved to, women evolved to sit around and take care of the kids, and men evolved to go out and hunt, and men were the warriors, and they have testosterone so they could do, this kind of blah, 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 all that stuff. Right. And so it's like, anthropologists, if you talk to them, they're like, no, 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 like, that's not true. Like, we know that, women were warriors and hunters, and they were doing this kind of movement, and we can look at their bones and yada, yada, yada. But regular people don't. This has not like reached the mainstream yet. And these ideas, I mean, even from progressive left wing educated people, are still out there, and they're very strong about like, well, this is what we do today because this is how we evolved. And it's actually not a true narrative. And so I really want to counter that. And I think the other part of that is just, who we are in the past and who we are now affects who we'll be in the future. And so we've got to correct these narratives so that we can then have a different future for, human beings and our bodies and women. Right. So So that's why I'm like, it's going to be almost like a part 2, I think, book in a certain way. So yeah, there's going to be much more to come. It's very exciting.
And on that very exciting note, we have arrived at the end of this episode. Thank you so much for being here. I always appreciate you coming here and listening to these stories. That is going to do it for me. I am Cherie Louise Turner. I'm the host and producer of Women's Running Stories. And until next Tuesday, I do wish you healthy, joyful, very, very strong strides forward. Women's Running. Women's Running Stories.